The Graceless Child. I am not a little girl anymore, and I am grateful and lighter for my lessened load. I have shouldered it. Ali Sheedy, from A Man's World. Tetchy met the tattooed man the night the wild dogs came down from the hills. She was waiting in among the roots of a tall, old gnarlwood tree, waiting and watching as she did for an hour or two every night, nested down on the mossy ground with her pack under her head and her mottled cloak wrapped around her for warmth. The leaves of the gnarlwood had yet to turn, but winter seemed to be in the air that night. She could see the tattooed man's breath cloud about him, white as pipe smoke in the moonlight. He stood just beyond the spread of the gnarlwood's twisted boughs, in the shadow of the lone standing stone that shared the hilltop with Tetchy's tree. He had a forbidding presence, tall and pale, with long, fine hair the color of bone tied back from his high brow. Above his leather trousers he was bare-chested, the swirl of his tattoos crawling across his blanched skin like pictographic insects. Tetchy couldn't read, but she knew enough to recognize that the dark blue markings were runes. She wondered if he'd come here to talk to her father. Tetchy burrowed a little deeper into her moss and cloak nest at the base of the gnarlwood. She knew better than to call attention to herself. When people saw her, it was always the same. At best, she was mocked. At worst, beaten. So she'd learned to hide. She became part of the night, turned to the darkness, away from the sun. The sun made her skin itch and her eyes tear. It seemed to steal the strength from her body until she could only move at a tortoise crawl. The night was kinder, and protected her as her mother once had. Between the teachings of the two, she'd long since learned a mastery over how to remain unseen. But her skills failed her tonight. The tattooed man turned slowly until his gaze was fixed on her hiding place. "I know you are there," he said. His voice was deep and resonant. It sounded to Tetchy like stones grinding against each other deep underhill, the way she imagined her father's voice would sound when he finally spoke to her. "Come out where I can see you, Tro." Shivering, Tetchy obeyed. She pushed aside the thin protection of her cloak and shuffled out into the moonlight on stubby legs. The tattooed man towered over her, but then so did most folk. She stood 3.5 feet high, her feet bare, the soles calloused to a rocky hardness. Her skin had a grayish hue, and her features were broad and square, as though chiseled from rough stone. The crudely fashioned tunic she wore as a dress hung like a sack from her stocky body. "I'm not a Tro," she said, trying to sound brave. Tros were tall, trollish creatures, not like her at all. She didn't have the height. The tattooed man regarded her for so long that she began to fidget under his scrutiny. In the distance, from 2 hills over and beyond the town, she heard a plaintive howl that was soon answered by more of the same. "You're just a child," the tattooed man finally said. Tetchy shook her head. "I'm almost 16 winters." Most girls her age already had a babe or two hanging onto their legs as they went about their work. "I meant in Tro terms," the tattooed man replied. "But I'm not—" "A Tro. I know. I heard you. But you've Tro blood all the same. Who was your dame, your sire?" "What business is it of yours?" Tetchy wanted to say. But something in the tattooed man's manner froze the words in her throat. Instead, she pointed to the long stone that reared out of the dark earth of the hilltop behind him. "The sun snared him," she said. "And your mother?" "Dead." "At childbirth?" Tetchy shook her head. "No, she lived long enough to spare Tetchy from the worst when she was still a child. Hannah Leaf protected her daughter from the townsfolk, and lived long enough to tell her, One winter's night, when the ice winds stormed through the town and rattled the loose plank walls of the shed behind the Cots Inn where they lived, "Whatever they tell you, Tetchy, whatever lies you hear, remember this. I went to him willingly." Tetchy rubbed at her eye with the thick knuckles of her hand. "I was 12 when she died," she said. "And you've lived?" The tattooed man waved a hand lazily to encompass the tree, the stone, the hills. "Here ever since?" Tetchy nodded slowly, wondering where the tattooed man intended their conversation to lead. "What do you eat?" What she could gather in the hills and the woods below, what she could steal from the farms surrounding the town, what she could plunder from the midden behind the market square those rare nights that she dared to creep into the town. But she said none of this, merely shrugged. "I see," the tattooed man said. She could still hear the wild dogs howl. They were closer now. Earlier that evening, a sour expression rode the face of the man who called himself Gadrian as he watched 3 men approach his table in the Cots Inn. By the time they had completed their passage through the inn's common room and reached him, he had schooled his features into a bland mask. They were merchants, he decided, and was half right. They were also, he learned when they introduced themselves, citizens of very high standing in the town of Burndale. He studied them carelessly from under hooded eyes as they eased their respective bulks into seats at his table. Each was more overweight than the next. The largest was Burndale's mayor. Not quite so corpulent was the elected head of the town guilds. The smallest was the town's sheriff, and he carried Gadrian's weight and half again on a much shorter frame. Silk vests, stretched taut over obesity, were perfectly matched to flounced shirts and pleated trousers. Their boots were leather, tooled with intricate designs and buffed to a high polish. Jowls hung over stiff collars. A diamond stud gleamed in the sheriff's left earlobe. "Something lives in the hills," the mayor said. Gadrian had forgotten the mayor's name as soon as it was spoken. He was fascinated by the smallness of the man's eyes and how closely set they were to each other. Pigs had eyes that were much the same, though the comparison, he chided himself, was insulting to the latter. "Something dangerous," the mayor added. The other two nodded, the sheriff adding, "A monster." Gadrian sighed. There was always something living in the hills. There were always monsters. Gadrian knew better than most how to recognize them, but he rarely found them in the hills. "And you want me to get rid of it?" he asked. The town council looked hopeful. Gadrian regarded them steadily for a long time without speaking. He knew their kind too well. They liked to pretend that the world followed their rules, that the wilderness beyond the confines of their villages and towns could be tamed, laid out in as tidy an order as the shelves of goods in their shops, of books in their libraries. But they also knew that under the facade of their order, the wilderness came stealing on paws that echoed with a click of claw on cobblestone. It crept into their streets and their dreams, and would take up lodging in their souls if they didn't eradicate it in time. So they came to men such as himself, men who walked the border that lay between the world they knew and so desperately needed to maintain, and the world as it truly was beyond the cluster of their stone buildings, a world that cast long shadows of fear across their streets whenever the moon went behind a bank of clouds and their street lamps momentarily faltered. They always recognized him, no matter how he appeared among them. These three surreptitiously studied the backs of his hands, and what they could see of the skin at the hollow of his throat where the collar of his shirt lay open. They were looking for confirmation of what their need had already told them he was. "You have gold, of course?" he asked. The pouch appeared as if by magic from the inside pocket of the mayor's vest. It made a satisfying clink against the wooden tabletop. Gadrian lifted a hand to the table, but it was only to grip the handle of his ale flagon and lift it to his lips. He took a long swallow, then set the empty flagon down beside the pouch. "I will consider your kind offer," he said. He rose from his seat and left them at the table, the pouch still untouched. When the landlord met him at the door, he jerked a thumb back to where the three men sat, turned in their seats to watch him leave. "I believe our good Lord Mayor was buying this round," he told the landlord, then stepped out into the night. He paused when he stood outside on the street, head cocked, listening. From far off, eastward, over more than one hill, he heard the baying of wild dogs, a distant, feral sound. He nodded to himself, and his lips shaped what might pass for a smile, though there was no humor in the expression. The townsfolk he passed gave him uneasy glances as he walked out of the town, into the hills that rose and fell like the tidal swells of a heathered ocean, stretching as far to the west as a man could ride in 3 days. What are you going to do to me?" Tetchy finally asked when the tattooed man's silence grew too long for her. His pale gaze seemed to mock her, but he spoke very respectfully. "I'm going to save your wretched soul." Tetchy blinked in confusion. "But I don't want it saved." "Understand," Tetchy said. "Can you hear them?" the tattooed man asked, only confusing her more. "The hounds," he added. She nodded uncertainly. "You've but to say the word, and I'll give them the strength to tear down the doors and shutters in the town below. Their teeth and claws will wreak the vengeance you crave." Tetchy took a nervous step away from him. "But I don't want anybody to be hurt," she said. "After all they've done to you?" "Mama said they don't know any better." The tattooed man's eyes grew grim. "And so you should just forgive them?" Too much thinking made Tetchy's head hurt. "I don't know," she said, panic edging into her voice. The tattooed man's anger vanished as though it had never lain there burning in his eyes. "Then what do you want?" he asked. Tetchy regarded him nervously. There was something in how he asked that told her he already knew, that this was what he'd been wanting from her all along. Her hesitation grew into a long silence. She could hear the dogs, closer than ever now, feral voices raised high and keening, almost like children crying in pain. The tattooed man's gaze bore down on her, forcing her to reply. Her hand shook as she lifted her arm to point at the long stone. "Ah," the tattooed man said. He smiled, but Tetchy drew no comfort from that. "That will cost," he said. I have no money." "Have I asked for money? Did I say one word about money?" You said it would cost." The tattooed man nodded. "Cost, yes. But the coin is a dearer mint than gold or silver." What could be dearer? Tetchy wondered. "I speak of blood," the tattooed man said before she could ask. "Your blood." His hand shot out and grasped her before she could flee. Blood, Tetchy thought. She cursed the blood that made her move so slow. "Don't be frightened," the tattooed man said. "I mean you no harm. It needs but a pinprick, 1 drop, perhaps 3, and not for me. For the stone, to call him back." His fingers loosened on her arm, and she quickly moved away from him. Her gaze shifted from the stone to him, back and forth, until she felt dizzy. "Mortal blood is the most precious blood of all," the tattooed man told her. Tetchy nodded. Didn't she know? Without her Tro blood, she'd be just like anyone else. No one would want to hurt her just because of who she was, of how she looked, of what she represented. They saw only midnight fears. All she wanted was to be liked. I can teach you tricks, the tattooed man went on. I can show you how to be anything you want. As he spoke, his features shifted until it seemed that there was a feral dog's head set upon that tattooed torso. Its fur was the same pale hue as the man's hair had been, and it still had his eyes, but it was undeniably a beast. The man was gone, leaving the strange hybrid creature in his place. Tetchy's eyes went wide in awe. Her short, fat legs trembled until she didn't think they could hold her upright anymore. Anything at all, the tattooed man said, as the dog's head was replaced by his own features once more. For a long moment, Tetchy could only stare at him. Her blood seemed to sing as it ran through her veins. To be anything at all. To be normal. But then the exhilaration that filled her trickled away. It was too good to be true, so it couldn't be true. Why? She asked. Why do you want to help me? I take pleasure in helping others, he replied. He smiled. His eyes smiled. There was such a kindly air about him that Tetchy almost forgot what he'd said about the wild dogs, about sending them down into Burndale to hunt down her tormentors. But she did remember, and the memory made her uneasy. The tattooed man seemed too much the chameleon for her to trust. He could teach her how to be anything she wanted to be. Was that why he could appear to be anything she wanted him to be? You hesitate, he said. Why? Tetchy could only shrug. It's your chance to right the wrong played on you at your birth. Tetchy's attention focused on the howling of the wild dogs as he spoke. To right the wrong. Their teeth and claws will wreak the vengeance you crave. But it didn't have to be that way. She meant no one ill. She just wanted to fit in, not hurt anyone. So if the choice was hers, she could simply choose not to hurt people, couldn't she? The tattooed man couldn't make her hurt people. What do I have to do? She asked. The tattooed man pulled a long silver needle from where it had been stuck in the front of his trousers. Give me your thumb, he said. Gadrian scented Tro as soon as he left Burndale behind him. It wasn't a strong scent, more a promise than an actuality at first, but the farther he got from the town, the more pronounced it grew. He stopped and tested the wind, but it kept shifting, making it difficult for him to pinpoint its source. Finally, he stripped off his shirt, letting it fall to the ground. He touched one of the tattoos on his chest, and a pale blue light glimmered in his palm when he took his hand away. He freed the glow into the air where it turned slowly, end on shimmering end. When it had given him the source of the scent, he snapped his fingers, and the light winked out. More assured now, he set off again, destination firmly in mind. The townsfolk, he realized, had been accurate for a change. A monster did walk the hills outside Burndale tonight. Nervously, Tetchy stepped forward. As she got closer to him, the blue markings on his chest seemed to shift and move, rearranging themselves into a new pattern that was as indecipherable to her as the old one had been. Tetchy swallowed thickly and lifted her hand, hoping it wouldn't hurt. She closed her eyes as he brought the tip of the needle to her thumb. There, the tattooed man said a moment later. It's all done. Tetchy blinked in surprise. She hadn't felt a thing. But now that the tattooed man had let go of her hand, her thumb started to ache. She looked at the 3 drops of blood that lay in the tattooed man's palm like tiny crimson jewels. Her knees went weak again, and this time she did fall to the ground. She felt hot and flushed, as though she were up and abroad at high noon, the sun broiling down on her, stealing her ability to move. Slowly, slowly she lifted her head. She wanted to see what happened when the tattooed man put her blood on the stone. But all he did was smile down at her and lick 3 drops with a tongue that seemed as long as a snake's, with the same kind of a fork at its tip. Tetchy tried to speak. "What have you done to me?" she wanted to say, but the words turned into a muddle before they left her mouth. It was getting harder to think. "When your mother was so kindly passing along all her advice to you," he said, "she should have warned you about not trusting strangers. Most folk have little use for your kind, it's true." Tetchy thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, then realized that the tattooed man must be shifting his shape once more. His hair grew darker as she watched. His complexion deepened. No longer pale and wan, he seemed to bristle with sorcerous energy now. "But then," the tattooed man went on, "they don't have the knowledge I do. I thank you for your vitality, halfling. There's nothing so potent as mortal blood stirred in a stew of fairy. A pity you won't live long enough to put the knowledge to use." He gave her a mocking salute, fingers tipped against his brow, then away, before turning his back on her. The night swallowed him. Tetchy fought to get to her own feet, but she just wore herself out until she could no longer even lift her head from the ground. Tears of frustration welled in her eyes. What had he done to her? She'd seen it for herself. He'd taken no more than 3 drops of her blood. But then why did she feel as though he'd taken it all? She stared up at the night sky, the stars blurring in her gaze, spinning, spinning, until finally she just let them take her away. She wasn't sure what had brought her back, but when she opened her eyes, it was to find that the tattooed man had returned. He crouched over her, concerned for her swimming in his dark eyes. His skin had regained its almost colorless complexion. His hair was bone white once more. She mustered what little strength she had to work up a gob of saliva and spat in his face. The tattooed man didn't move. She watched the saliva dribble down his cheek until it fell from the tip of his chin to the ground beside her. "Poor child," he said. "What has he done to you?" The voice was wrong, Tetchy realized. He'd changed his voice now. The low grumble of stones grinding against each other deep under a hill had been replaced by a soft, melodious tonality that was comforting on the ear. He touched the fingers of one hand to a tattoo high on his shoulder, waking a blue glow that flickered on his fingertips. She flinched when he touched her brow with the hand, but the contact of blue fingers against her skin brought an immediate easing to the weight of her pain. When he sat back on his haunches, she found she had the strength to lift herself up from the ground. Her gaze spun for a moment, then settled down. The new perspective helped stem the helplessness she'd been feeling. "I wish I could do more for you," the tattooed man said. Tetchy merely glared at him, thinking, "Haven't you done enough?" The tattooed man gave her a mild look, head cocked slightly as though listening to her thoughts. "He calls himself Nalorn on this side of the gates," he said finally. "But you would call him Nightmare, did you meet him in the land of his origin, beyond the gates of sleep. He thrives on pain and torment. We have been enemies for a very long time." Tetchy blinked in confusion. "But you—" The tattooed man nodded. "I know. We look the same. We are brothers, child. I am the elder. My name is Dream. On this side of the gates, I answer to the name Gadrian." Your brother, he took something from me." He stole your mortal ability to dream, Gadrian told her. Tricked you into giving it freely so that it would retain its potency. Techi shook her head. I don't understand. Why would he come to me? I'm no one. I don't have any powers or magics that anyone could want. Not that you can use yourself, perhaps, but the mix of Tro and mortal blood creates a potent brew. Each drop of such blood is a talisman in the hands of one who understands its properties. Is he stronger than you? Techi asked. Not in the land beyond the gates of sleep. There I am the elder. The realms of dream are mine, and all who sleep are under my rule when they come through the gates. He paused, dark eyes thoughtful, before adding, In this world, we are more evenly matched. Nightmares come from him? Techi asked. Gadrian nodded. It isn't possible for a ruler to see all the parts of his kingdom at once. Nalorn is the father of lies. He creeps into sleeping minds when my attention is distracted elsewhere, and makes a horror of healing dreams. He stood up then, towering over her. I must go, he said. I must stop him before he grows too strong. Techi could see the doubt in his eyes, and understood then that though he knew his brother to be stronger than him, he would not admit to it, would not turn from what he saw as his duty. She tried to stand, but her strength still hadn't returned. Take me with you, she said. Let me help you. You don't know what you ask. But I want to help. Gadrian smiled. Bravely spoken. But this is war, and no place for a child. Techi searched for the perfect argument to convince him, but couldn't find it. He said nothing, but she knew as surely as if he'd spoken why he didn't want her to come. She would merely slow him down. She had no skills, only her night sight and the slowness of her limbs. Neither would be of help. During the lull in their conversation, when that understanding came to her, she heard the howling once more. The dogs, she said. There are no wild dogs, Gadrian told her. That is only the sound of the wind as it crosses the empty reaches of his soul. He laid a hand on her head, tousled her hair. I'm sorry for the hurt that's come to you with this night's work. If the fates are kind to me, I will try to make amends. Before Techi could respond, he strode off, westward. She tried to follow, but could barely crawl after him. By the time she reached the crest of the hill, the long stone rearing above her, she saw Gadrian's long legs carrying him up the side of the next hill. In the distance, blue lightning played, close to the ground. Nalorn, she thought. He was waiting for Gadrian. Nalorn meant to kill the Dream Lord, and then he would rule the land beyond the gates of sleep. There would be no more dreams, only nightmares. People would fear sleep, for it would no longer be a haven. Nalorn would twist its healing peace into pain and despair. And it was all her fault. She'd been thinking only of herself. She'd wanted to talk to her father, to be normal. She hadn't known who Nalorn was at the time, but ignorance was no excuse. It doesn't matter what others think of you, her mother had told her once, but what you think of yourself. Be a good person, and no matter how other people will talk of you, what they say can only be a lie. They called her a monster and feared her. She saw now that it wasn't a lie. She turned to the long stone that had been her father before the sun had snared him and turned him to stone. Why couldn't that have happened to her before all of this began? Why couldn't she have been turned to stone the first time the sun touched her? Then Nalorn could never have played on her vanity and her need, would never have tricked her. If she'd been stone... Her gaze narrowed. She ran a hand along the rough surface of the standing stone, and Nalorn's voice spoke in her memory. I speak of blood. It needs but a pinprick. 1 drop, perhaps 3. And not for me, for the stone, to call him back. To call him back. Nalorn had proved there was magic in her blood. If he hadn't lied, could she call her father back? And if he did return, would he listen to her? It was night, the time when a Tro was strongest. Surely when she explained, her father would use that strength to help Gadrian. A babble of townsfolk's voices clambered up through her memory. A Tro will drink your blood as sure as look at you. Saw one, I did, sitting up by the boneyard, and wasn't he chewing on a thigh bone he dug up? The creatures have no heart, no soul. They'll feed on their own, if there's no other meat to be found. No, Techi told herself. Those were the lies her mother had warned her against. If her mother had loved the Tro, then he couldn't have been evil. Her thumb still ached where Nalorn had pierced it with his long silver pin, but the tiny wound had closed. Techi bit at it until the salty taste of blood touched her tongue. Then she squeezed her thumb, smearing the few drops of blood that welled up against the rough surface of the stone. She had no expectations, only hope. She felt immediately weak, just as she had when Nalorn had taken the 3 small drops of blood from her. The world began to spin for the second time that night, and she started to fall once more, only this time she fell into the stone. The hard surface seemed to have turned to the consistency of mud, and it swallowed her whole. When consciousness finally returned, Techi found herself lying with her face pressed against hard-packed dirt. She lifted her head, squinting in the poor light. The long stone was gone, along with the world she knew. For as far as she could see, there was only a desolate wasteland, illuminated by a sickly twilight for which she could discover no source. It was still the landscape she knew. The hills and valleys had the same contours as those that lay west of Burndale, but it was all changed. Nothing seemed to grow here anymore. Nothing lived at all in this place, except for her, and she had her doubts about that as well. If this was a dead land, a lifeless reflection of the world she knew, then might she not have died to reach it? Oddly enough, the idea didn't upset her. It was as though, having seen so much that was strange already tonight, nothing more could surprise her. When she turned to where the old gnarlwood had been in her world, a dead tree stump stood. It was no more than 3 times her height, the area about it littered with dead branches. The main body of the tree had fallen away from where Techi knelt, lying down the slope. She rose carefully to her feet, but the dizziness and weakness she'd felt earlier had both fled. In the dirt at her feet, where the long stone would have stood in her world, there was a black pictograph etched deeply into the soil. It reminded her of the tattoos that she'd seen on the chests of the Dream Lord and his brother, as though it had been plucked from the skin of one of them, enlarged and cast down on the ground. Goosebumps traveled up her arms. She remembered what Gadrian had told her about the land he ruled, how the men and women of her world could enter it only after passing through the gates of sleep. She'd been so weak when she offered her blood to the Longstone, her eyelids growing so heavy. Was this all just a dream, then? And if so, what was its source? Did it come from Gadrian, or from his brother Nalorn, at whose bidding nightmares were born? She went down on one knee to look more closely at the pictograph. It was a bit like a man with a tangle of rope around his feet, and lines standing out from his head as though his hair stood on end. She reached out with one cautious finger and touched the tangle of lines at the foot of the rough figure. The dirt was damp there. She rubbed her finger against her thumb. The dampness was oily to the touch. Scarcely aware of what she was doing, she reached down again and traced the symbol, the slick oiliness letting her finger slide easily along the edged grooves in the dirt. When she came to the end, the pictograph began to glow. She stood quickly, backing away. What had she done? The blue glow rose into the air, holding to the shape that lay in the dirt. A faint, rhythmic thrumming rose from all around her, as though the ground was shifting, but she felt no vibration underfoot. There was just the sound, low and ominous. A branch cracked behind her, and she turned to the ruin of the gnarlwood. A tall shape stood outlined against the sky. She started to call out to it, but her throat closed up on her. And then she was aware of the circle of eyes that watched her from all sides of the hilltop. Pale eyes that flickered with the reflection of the glowing pictograph that hung in the air where the long stone stood in her world. They were set low to the ground. Feral eyes. She remembered the howling of the wild dogs in her own world. There are no wild dogs, Gadrian had told her. That is only the sound of the wind as it crosses the empty reaches of his soul. As the eyes began to draw closer, she could make out the triangular-shaped heads of the creatures they belonged to, the high-backed bodies with which they slunk forward. Oh, why had she believed Gadrian? She knew him no better than Nalorn. Who was to say that either of them was to be trusted? One of the dogs rose up to its full height and stalked forward on stiff legs. The low growl that arose in his chest echoed the rumble of sound that her foolishness with the glowing pictograph had called up. She started to back away from the dog, but now another and a third stepped forward, and there was no place to which she could retreat. She turned her gaze to the silent figure that stood in among the fallen branches of the gnarlwood. Please, she managed. I meant no harm. The figure made no response, but the dogs growled at the sound of her voice. The nearest pulled its lips back in a snarl. This was it, Techi thought. If she wasn't dead already in this land of the dead, then she soon would be. But then the figure by the tree moved forward. It had a slow, shuffling step. Branches broke underfoot as it closed the distance between them. The dogs backed away from Techi and began to whine uneasily. "Begone," the figure said. Its voice was low and craggy, stone against stone, like that of the first tattooed man, Nalorn, the Dream Lord's brother, who turned dreams into nightmares. It was a counterpoint to the deep thrumming that seemed to come from the hill under Techi's feet. The dogs fled at the sound of the man's voice. Techi's knees knocked against each other as he moved closer still. She could see the rough, chiseled shape of his features now, the shock of tangled hair, stiff as dried gorse, the wide bulk of his shoulders and torso, the corded muscle upon muscle that made up arms and legs. His eyes were sunk deep under protruding brows. He was like the first rough shaping that a sculptor might create when beginning a new work, face and musculature merely outlined rather than clearly defined, as it would be when the sculpture was complete. Except this sculpture wasn't stone, nor clay, nor marble. It was flesh and blood. And though he was no taller than a normal man, he seemed like a giant to Techi, towering over her as though the side of a mountain had pulled loose to walk the hills. "Why did you call me?" he asked. "Call?" Techi replied. "But I didn't." Her voice trailed off. She gazed on him with sudden hope and understanding. "Father?" she asked in a small voice. The giant regarded her in a long silence. Then slowly he bent down to one knee so that his head was level with hers. "You," he said in a voice grown soft with wonder. "You are Hannah's daughter." Techi nodded nervously. "My daughter?" Techi's nervousness fled. She no longer saw a fearsome Tro out of legend, but her mother's lover. The gentleness and warmth that had called her mother from Burndale to where he waited for her on the moors washed over her. He opened his arms, and she went to him, sighing as he embraced her. My name's Techi, she said into his shoulder. Techi, he repeated, making a low, rumbling song of her name. I never knew I had a daughter. I came every night to your stone, she said, hoping you'd return. Her father pulled back a little and gave her a serious look. I can't ever go back, he said. But, he shook his head, dead is dead, Techi. I can't return. But this is a horrible place to have to live. He smiled, craggy features shifting like a mountainside suddenly rearranging its terrain. I don't live here, he said. I can't explain how it is. There are no words to describe the difference. Is Mama there? Hannah died? Techi nodded. Years ago, but I still miss her. I will look for her, the Tro said. I will give her your love. He rose then, looming over her again. But I must go now, Techi. This is unhallowed land, the perilous border that lies between life and death. Bide here too long, living or dead, and you remain here forever. But Techi had wanted to ask him to take her with him to look for her mother, to tell him that living meant only pain and sorrow for her. But then she realized she was only thinking of herself again. She still wasn't sure that she trusted Gadrian, but if he had been telling her the truth, then she had to try to help him. Her own life was a nightmare. She wouldn't wish for all people to share such a life. I need your help, she said, and told him then of Gadrian and Nalorn, the war that was being fought between dream and nightmare that Nalorn could not be allowed to win. Her father shook his head sadly. I can't help you, Techi. It's not physically possible for me to return. But if Gadrian loses, that would be an evil thing, her father agreed. There must be something we can do. He was silent for long moments then. What is it? Techi asked. What don't you want to tell me? I can do nothing, her father said. But you... Again he hesitated. What? Techi asked. What is it that I can do? I can give you of my strength, her father said. You'll be able to help your Dream Lord then. But it will cost you. You will be more Tro than ever, and remain so. More Tro? Techi thought. She looked at her father, felt the calm that seemed to wash in peaceful waves from his very presence. The townsfolk might think that a curse, but she no longer did. I'd be proud to be more like you, she said. You will have to give up all pretense of humanity, her father warned her. When the sun rises, you must be barrowed under hill, or she'll make you stone. I already only come out at night, she said. Her father's gaze searched hers, and then he sighed. Yours has not been an easy life, he said. Techi didn't want to talk about herself anymore. Tell me what to do, she said. You must take some of my blood, her father told her. Blood again. Techi had seen and heard enough about it to last her a lifetime tonight. But how can you do that? She asked. You're just a spirit. Her father touched her arm. Given flesh in this half-world by your call. Have you a knife? When Techi shook her head, he lifted his thumb to his mouth and bit down on it. Dark liquid welled up at the cut as he held his hand out to her. It will burn, he said. Techi nodded nervously. Closing her eyes, she opened her mouth. Her father brought his thumb down across her tongue. His blood tasted like fire, burning its way down her throat. She shuddered with the searing pain of it, eyes tearing so that even when she opened them, she was still blind. She felt her father's hand on her head. He smoothed the tangle of her hair and then kissed her. "Be well, my child," he said. "We will look for you, your mother and I, when your time to join us has come and you finally cross over." There were 100 things Tetchy realized that she wanted to say, but vertigo overtook her, and she knew that not only was he gone, but the empty world as well. She could feel grass under her, a soft breeze on her cheek. When she opened her eyes, the long stone reared up on one side of her, the gnarlwood on the other. She turned to look where she'd last seen the blue lightning flare before she'd gone into the stone. There was no light there now. She got to her feet, feeling invigorated rather than weak. Her night sight seemed to have sharpened. Every sense was more alert. She could almost read the night simply through the pores of her skin. The townsfolk were blind, she realized. She had been blind. They had all missed so much of what the world had to offer. But the townsfolk craved a narrower world rather than a wider one, and she had a task yet to perform. She set off to where the lightning had been flickering. The grass was all burned away, the ground itself scorched on the hilltop that was her destination. She saw a figure lying in the dirt and hesitated, unsure as to who it was, Gadrian or his brother. She moved cautiously forward until finally she knelt by the still figure. His eyes opened and looked upon her with a weak gaze. "I was not strong enough," Gadrian said, his voice still sweet and ringing, but much subdued. "Where did he go?" Tetchy asked. "To claim his own, the land of dream." Tetchy regarded him for a long moment, then lifted her thumb to her mouth. It was time for blood again, but this would be the last time. Gadrian tried to protest, but she pushed aside his hands and let the drops fall into his mouth. 1, 2, 3. Gadrian swallowed. His eyes went wide with an almost comical astonishment. "Where? How?" "I found my father," Tetchy said. "This is the heritage he left me." Senses all more finely attuned, to be sure, but when she lifted an arm to show Gadrian, the skin was darker, grayer than before, and tough as bark. And she would never see the day again. "You should not have," Gadrian began, but Tetchy cut him off. "Is it enough?" she asked. "Can you stop him now?" Gadrian sat up. He rolled his shoulders, flexed his hands and arms, his legs. "More than enough," he said. "I feel 100 years younger." Knowing him for what he was, Tetchy didn't think he was exaggerating. Who knew how old the Dream Lord was? He would have been born with the first dream. He cupped her face with his hands and kissed her on the brow. "I will try to make amends for what my brother has done to you this night," he said. "The whole world owes you for the rescue of its dreams." "I don't want any reward," Tetchy said. "We'll talk of that when I return for you," Gadrian said. "If you can find me," Tetchy thought, but she merely nodded in reply. Gadrian stood. One hand plucked at a tattoo just to one side of his breastbone and tossed the ensuing blue light into the air. It grew into a shimmering portal. Giving her one more grateful look, he stepped through. The portal closed behind him, winking out in a flare of blue sparks, like those cast by a fire when a log's tossed on. Tetchy looked about the scorched hilltop, then set off back to Burndale. She walked its cobblestoned streets, one lone figure, dwarfed by the buildings, more kin to their walls and foundations than to those sleeping within. She thought of her mother when she reached the Cots Inn and stood looking at the shed around back by the stables where they had lived for all of those years. Finally, just as the dawn was pinking the horizon, she made her way back to the hill where she'd first met the tattooed men. She ran her fingers along the bark of the gnarlwood, then stepped closer to the long stone, standing on the east side of it. It wasn't entirely true that she could never see the day again. She could see it, if only once. Tetchy was still standing there when the sun rose and snared her. And then there were 2 standing stones on the hilltop, keeping company to the old gnarlwood tree. One tall, and one much smaller. But Tetchy herself was gone to follow her parents, a lithe spirit of a child finally, her gracelessness left behind in stone.